I'm really delighted to introduce our guest today, Eleni Stecopoulos. Eleni is a poet, essayist, and critic, originally from New York, now living in San Francisco. She's taught at Bard College and the University of San Francisco, and now works with writers as an independent editor, manuscript consultant, and mentor. She's the author of Armies of Compassion, a poetry collection, Visceral Poetics, a hybrid of criticism and memoir, and most recently, a tour de force collection of essays, Dreaming in the Fault Zone, a Poetics of Healing, which many of us here today have read excerpts of this week and discussed yesterday, or Monday. Eleni and I connected in a sort of, I think we had sort of met before, but we connected in a significant way last fall around oracular poetics, and have been in an unfolding conversation and friendship since then. And Dreaming in the Fault Zone has had a big impact on me. This text makes visible medicine as cosmology, as cosmological, and as embodied beings. Of course, this is a domain we all have deep stakes in. Constructed as patients, receivers of medicine, Eleni's work challenges us to restore reciprocity, sensitivity, poetics, and dialogue to the scene of medicine. She explicates ancient and contemporary medicine, looking at the iatrogenic effects of an approach to healing that divides psyche and soma, in which spirit and practices of medicine are severed, in which medicine is so much alienated labor and the body becomes, as she writes, a work site. Her thought punctures this metaphysics of separation as if with an acupuncture needle to draw blood, energy, immune system action to the fault line, a ceremony of repair and reparation. The book is, above all, dialectical and question-driven in drawing out the layered ways in which language and medicine are aesthetic, and in developing the implications of this idea, asking, quote, does poetry harbor the malady? Does it hollow out the remedy for a boat? It is tempting to say that poets are proxy dreamers who stay in the impasse to provide passage for others. As victim of the muses, the poet plays a scapegoat, or the poet can feel for the polis, somaticize collective trauma in the form of the chorus. The profound and illuminating way that Eleni engages with paradox, contradiction, indeterminacy, and the chronic can help us to imagine, sense, feel, and think our way through this abysmal conjuncture in which we see hard-won conditions of possibility and provision for pluralist, democratic functioning, including, crucially, public health systems, and it seems the entirety of what we call public goods under demolition. How can we continue to dream in this fault zone? Consider the abaton about which she writes. The abaton's restriction mirrors the condition that brings you there. The site absorbs this difficulty and formalizes it, sacralizes it as a place of stillness. It replicates the impasse of living with a condition for a long time, the impasse of the many attempts, the many essays. You practice this impasse by entering it. In this time of impasse, we can relearn from her text how to incubate, how to, as she writes, immerse in the matrix of the wound, to dream for one another, on one another's behalf. Eleni is a poet and a scholar who feels for the polis, and Asclepius, a maker of remedies. Please warmly welcome the brilliant Eleni Stecopoulos.
Thank you, Miranda, for that beautiful and just very moving introduction that I'm grateful for, but really I want to send back out to everyone. As you say, this idea of dreaming for each other and dreaming for and dreaming on behalf. And that sense of being by each other's side and accompaniment is something that I will probably return to a few times this morning. Thank you so much, Shaw. Thank you for the invitation to come here. It's wonderful to be back at Evergreen. I was here quite a few years ago, and I remember wonderful conversations with students and faculty, so it's really a treat to be back. I'll be speaking mostly extemporaneously today and reading at times from Dreaming in the Fault Zone certain passages that have come back up for me and in conversation with Miranda and with others, and thinking about this moment, which is a difficult one in many ways, and in which here in the United States and really with the impact around the world, we kind of feel like we've been knocked down or had the wind knocked out of us, right? And how do we sort of get up and regather ourselves? I've been thinking about making work in these times, making art in these times that many will call dark times, and I don't like to call them that. The dark in my book is something that I reach back to, as Miranda said, to ancient medicine, to the ancient clinics where they practice dream incubation. And my interpretation of that is a purposeful space that you would enter the dark. You would enter the dark in order to deal with a chronic condition. The people who could not be cured with conventional medicine could make the pilgrimage to an Asclepion dedicated to Apollo and his son Asclepius, the divine physician. And so it was people who had not been cured, right, who were in a kind of impasse. And the name for this space, the sunken or the closed part of the dormitory, is the abaton, literally not to be stepped into or impassable. And so I came to see this, and also in collaboration with a fellow poet, the poet and builder Robert Kotchik, I came to see this abaton, this impassable place, as a deliberate space of impasse. And with Robert's work as well as an architectural form for impasse. And so dark is not a pejorative to me, and I will read a little bit on that. These are not dark times. This is from Dreaming in the Fault Zone, from an essay called For Opacity. These are not dark times. The Christians who broke off the arms of statues and carved a cross into Aphrodite's forehead tried to disable darkness, to deform it as adversary. But darkness is all forms. There is no deformation, no antagonism in it. Only relation, the poetics that founds all poetics. Edouard Glissant's Chaos Monde. In Ana Mendieta's Silhouette, the ash becomes an entrance to the dark. Don't be afraid of the dark, you said, when I was afraid to sleep. Be afraid of what people do in the light. In 2016, When talk of dark times spread in my country, when apparitions of fascism and extinction thickened, I turned back to the philosophy of Édouard Glissant. I turned again to his concept of opacity for sustenance and life. In Oakland, I incubated with Margit Galanter, a movement researcher and choreographer, Qigong and Feldenkrais practitioner, the poet Denise Leto, the poet Giovanni Singleton, and other dancers and writers. Together we sat in the unknown, as Glissant writes, quote, an unknown that does not terrify. Together we read Glissant's thought. He writes, we must reclaim the right to opacity. It is not necessary to understand someone. In the verb to understand, comprendre, there is the verb to take, prendre, in order to wish to live with them. When two people stop loving, they usually say to each other, I no longer understand you, as though to love it were necessary to understand. That is, to reduce the other to transparency. If these are dark times, then, as Glissant wrote, quote, we clamor for the right to opacity for everyone. I understand Glissant's opacity as the irreducibility of a language and a people. Antillean Creole is opaque. Opacity is what cannot be rendered transparent by an attempt to comprehend an acquisitive act. The right to opacity opposes itself to a humanism that reduces people to universals, territory that can be annexed. Opacity is what imperial designs cannot touch. Opacity is not separation. It is not driven or maintained by fear or hatred. As Glissant writes, it has its own kind of transparency, its own clarity, one that does not reduce. For example, opacity is in the way disability culture shows with utmost clarity that every body is particular and our diagnoses and classifications are not our identities. Opacity is not otherness or alterity. It is not aberration. It is opposed to the fingering of the passbook, its inherent accusation, the assignment of personhood, or the denial of personhood. So what I refer to is a practice that Margit Galanter has been doing since 2014, that Margit calls caving. And as I told you, and some of you have read, I was interested in delving into ancient practices of incubation in the ancient Mediterranean. But in time, I also came to know incubation, dream incubation, trance, meditative states. I came to know it in some contemporary forms through the thinking and practices of new friends and community spaces. Years after I learned about incubation and vision seeking on the ground, I found myself caving with dance poet Margit Galanter on the floor of an Oakland studio, burrowing, stretching, making infinite shapes or lying still, under a blanket whose weave let in just a few specks of light. At the core of cave forms, both a practice and a set of performances, is incubation, under blankets in the studio or at home, lying on cliffs over the ocean, or dancing in the caves of Northern California. For Margit, caves are living sources of stillness and potential, nourishment and regeneration. Caving names the movement between the inner stillness of non-doing and a praxis that reaches for the stars. Caves are also within us, our orifices, which are sources, as Margit writes, for production and for pleasure, and in our guts, where the loss of flora in the biome means an impact on collective thinking. In 2016, we sat in the dark to mark the stillness and darkness of the season of water in a winter that already felt especially pronounced in loss. How would we sit together in a changed world that people were calling dark times? I associated cave forms with working late at night away from the surveillance of institutions. It meant the stillness and the constellation of incubating in the hide under the stars. It meant the constellation of poetics itself, the serpentine motion of the poem. It practiced slowness and valued chronicity in a society dedicated to production and progress. So, caving with Margit and with others in the East Bay, Oakland and Berkeley, is one of the gatherings and I guess communal forms that are both aesthetic and forms of solidarity. And for me, those always go together. It's one of the forms that I'm holding, especially in this time. And it's a time in which I feel like there are attempts to force us to be as rigid and as reactionary and as fundamentalist as the regime that has launched its wrecking ball, as Miranda said, its demolition. And so how do we resist that? And resist itself is a word, right, that suggests opposition and rigidity. But I'm interested in forms that feel open and multiform, like the multiform dark. And so I'm looking for passages that can be, for myself, hopefully for you, little indices or instruments to feel some other way and to not be coerced into the kind of rigidity and fundamentalism, the fundamentalism of retribution and the very apparent retribution of fundamentalist people in this country. Alfonso Lingus says something about hope that I'd like to read to you. I mean, the question of hope, hope is difficult to talk about without being saccharine or resorting to cliches, but I've come to understand that, when I began this project, a project of curations in the Bay Area around the Poetics of Healing, drawing in many people from many different backgrounds, physicians, body workers, activists, poets, artists, performance artists. I don't think I ever thought of it explicitly, but I see that hope was always a dimension of it, the possibility of healing while living in a society that's very sick and in which there may not be cures or that appear as cures. And how do we live with chronic conditions that are collective as well as personal? How do we keep that possibility of healing? How can we think healing together? How can we make forms and make art and curate in a way that is healing? And so this sense of hope, or this question of hope, came up for me again in the last few days. The experiment always takes place in not knowing. Hope, perhaps, but even that is idiopathic. Alfonso Lingus writes, "The first thought I have about hope is that hope is hope against the evidence." So there is a kind of discontinuity in time. There is a break, and something starts out of nowhere. This space of, so that's Alfonso Lingus, the philosopher. This space of impasse is where healing falls. Healing is the essay in impasse. And so this sense of essay as trying something, as experiment, as failing, as going down one road and that doesn't work out and then having to go down another road. My book is a book of essays and some essays that look like poems. I don't really distinguish between poem and essay. In some ways, the book for me is one enormous poem. But this sense of essays as trying something, I've come to see as really being very intimately linked to seeking healing. That, in other words, that you have to try things. Though, whether you're a person in, 330 BCE, or whether you're a person today in 2025, you have to try things, right? Whether that's surgery or traveling to, some alternative practitioner, desperate, or making a ceremony, calling on ancestors, calling on intermediaries. And this is one of the things that I remind myself of, that we have to try things, and that maybe hope is that practice in which we're willing to keep trying things, even in the face of brutal evidence. And along with trying things, there's a sense that for me, and where I end up in my book, is really in a vision of health as something collective and ecological, that there's really no individual health. That health is something in which we all have to be present. Miranda had mentioned public health, and just today, I won't say what is in the news, but public health is very much under assault. But even before this regime or another regime or administration, if you want to call it that, we really don't have public health in this country. As the political anthropologist Eric Reinhardt says, public health is not just medical intervention, right? It's not just medicines and procedures, even as those remain very difficult to access, right, for many people. But it's getting at the roots, the social roots, the roots that lead to disease, the roots of inequity and poverty and oppression. And that public health really has to attend to all of that. So, this is a very overt and very obvious assault. But the fact is, we really haven't had. We don't really truly have good public health in this country. So, this vision of health as collective. One of the things that I come back to and that I come to by the end of the book, and it pops up in various ways, is this notion of accompaniment, and literally being by each other's side. And okay, that doesn't only have to be physical, but being by the other side, and that's a practice, and that's a commitment. And I'll read to you a little bit from an essay in the book called The Outside Inside, which is an essay that looks at different kinds of medicine, the relationship, or sometimes the dichotomy between medicine and healing, and learning from other cultural forms in a way where they can't just be grafted on to your culture, but because other people, other places, and in other times or in the present have tried other things, have come to different ways. That also means that different ways and other things and otherwise can be possible for us in this time and this place. In much of the world, there's no personhood outside kinship. Your relatives, human and extra-human, make you a person. You're a person because of and with others. I write about a presumed dialogue between two individuals, and I assume patient is singular because that is the paradigm I know. In that paradigm, the problem of subjectivity always comes up. Empathy is a problem, an ideal, a value, an impossibility, a burden, always a problem. But what if who I perceive as multiple individuals are together a person? What if the narrative is co-authored? What if feeling is co-feeling? The linguistic and medical anthropologist T.S. Harvey, who specializes in global public health and medical communication, identifies the Quiché Maya people who visit a government-sponsored clinic in Guatemala as wellness seekers rather than patients. The patient role in clinical settings is acquired, he writes, neither a universal nor an intuitive way of being in the world. The Quiché people who came to the clinic rarely came alone, but in the encounters Harvey recorded in groups of 2 to 5. Multiple members of the group speak and describe the problem. What I might think of as a patient history is not a monologue, but interactive and intersubjective, a, quote, composition of speech and silence, end quote, co-authored by the voices of all in the room. The wellness seekers, quote, frequently presented multiple bodies rather than a single body as the site or sites of sickness, writes Harvey. Sometimes they might visit the clinic standing in on behalf of other physically absent patients. In both the co-composition of the narrative and in the experience of illness, Quiché people express their preference for living life accompanied. And one of the things that I write about in this chapter and elsewhere is the way that Harvey chose not to present the composition as a standard transcript or interview, but instead he arranged it as a musical score, as a multivocal or polyphonic score, following other anthropologists who listened to the way people told stories and wanted to transcribe them as a work of performance, building in all the cues and sounds and gestures and the whole communal experience. So that's one of the examples that I'm holding, thinking about accompaniment in this time, rather than the rigidity and fundamentalism and the attempts to narrow our range of affect and narrow the possibility of feeling, which is at the root of aesthetics, perception and feeling. I was saying yesterday, we can't let them turn us into. We don't need to mirror them in being as rigid and as constrained as they are. And that is one of the hopes that I always have about making art, is that it allows for an unknown range of feelings and perceptions and attempts and essays. You know, I'm afraid I didn't bring my phone, so if someone could tell me perhaps what time it is. 12? 12 o'clock? Thank you. Okay. Okay. This is from an essay called The New Score. Wounds bind nations into being. Nations inflict identity. No one I know wants to think with ethnos anymore. The myth of the nation that is not ethnic, or the nation of many ethnoi, Walt Whitman's greatest poem, is almost finished in my country, while the myth of a white ethno-state becomes more noxious. My students in 2016 were mostly multilingual, the norm for people in the world. If I was going to teach writing in English, I also wanted to foster a hospitable place for the languages they brought with them. So they could code blend in their papers. They could decide what they wanted to translate into English and what they would leave opaque. After learning about language revitalization, they wrote language portraits to explore their own repertoire, which could include lingos and constructed languages, They shared words and phrases they found funny, beautiful, untranslatable. They shared idioms and song lyrics. One day I walked into class, steeling myself to keep from shaking. A demagogue riding a populist wave of xenophobia, misogyny, and Islamophobia had been elected because of an undemocratic system. I looked into my students' faces. Some were openly weeping. The experience of being targeted was not new to them, but now they feared it would increase. Would people and their families be deported? Would they be able to stay in the US? Would they fall victim to a hate crime? What we could do was go on doing our work together, questioning, becoming sharper readers, cultivating our own poetic powers, telling the truth about complexity and uncertainty, letting words have many meanings. No one could take this ethos from them. We had named and listened to each other's languages. Now we recommitted ourselves to their vitality. We discovered that we still wanted the medicine of relationships that require translation, because that is the condition of living. Plants keep records of their responses to drought and heat waves. Cells show marks where genes were activated in response to disaster. Similarly, through expressive culture, humans keep records of creative response, not just the score of trauma marked on the body, but the new score, directions for performance that enabled them to act otherwise, sense otherwise, speak as other, sing as other, listen as other. If I take the lives of language seriously, if I recognize its criticality to sustaining life, then I have to learn something about languages I do not know. I have to learn about verbal arts as part of the web of life. This question of what does art do, right, comes up. Perhaps it's a question that is important to you. It's one that's embedded in my book, along with associated questions like, can poetry be therapeutic? What are the ways in which it can be therapeutic? Is there something other than catharsis? How does language heal? And sometimes, does language need to be healed? But this question of, two questions that I'm bringing together. What is to be done? Right? What do we do? What can we do? And what does art do? What's the role of aesthetics at this moment? For some people, this may be a tired question. For me, it's always worth asking and re-asking, and in at different moments and in different contexts. I don't have it with me here. On the plane to Seattle, I was reading from the Palestinian poet Rafat al-Harir's posthumous collection, If I Must Die, and reading Rafat's writing, reading the editor's introduction, it was clear that Rafat thought that writing, telling stories, writing testimonies, trying to educate the world about Palestinian struggle, all of that was doing something. My understanding is he was writing up until he was murdered. So Rafat al-Harir is one of the people, and by extension, one of the communities that I'm holding with me as I think about collective ways of trying things and hope, even, right, and especially against hope, against the evidence. I'm holding the writer Brandon Shimoda's new book, The Afterlife is Letting Go, which Brandon takes up the legacy and the ongoing trauma of the afterlife of the incarceration camps where Japanese Americans were incarcerated during the Second World War. Brandon he launched his book at City Lights about a week and a half ago, but it was really a collective event of multiple generations where many people spoke. There are many, many voices in Brandon's book. Some survivors of the camps spoke. Descendants of survivors of the camps spoke. The place was packed. It was Sunday, January 19th. People spoke in solidarity with and feeling a kinship with undocumented people and migrants today who are being detained and incarcerated in the same landscapes in the Southwest as either they were as children or their ancestors were. So this is another effort and gathering that I'm holding, and perhaps another repository of hope, that sense of solidarity, this sense, it was it was visceral in the room. It was very clear that Brandon's book was experienced as healing by so many people that were present. It doesn't take away the history. It doesn't take away the pain and the memories. It's not some kind of a cure as eradication, but holding it together and being together in Brandon's beautiful and incredible book filled with the questions to all of these people and their voices. Is clear that it was healing for many people there, including me. I have a line in my book that, says, what or how the poem treats is unknown. The poet doesn't know either. And reflecting, again on this time, it's funny when I finished writing the book, right? Because there's always a long production process. You finish writing, and then there's copy editing, and there's typesetting, and so it's always like at least a year, sometimes far longer, before the book comes out. And I had this idea that, well, some of the things I'm writing about are probably going to feel outdated, when it comes out, and people may not want to read, about 2020 or COVID or or about Trump, and that's that kind of thinking. A writer's anxiety or an author's anxiety is, it's a fallacy in one sense, because all the conditions that created those things are still with us. We're still in the impasse. And, we're living in a regressive time. That's something that I say to myself a lot. Thinking about regression and, what and the kind of horror that people are experiencing now with, the thug came back. But then I realize, is it regression or is it just history? Is it just that history's recursive? Things are recursive. They're not in a straight line. And there are losses, and there are bewildering reversals and undoings and destruction. And maybe when you get old enough, you're able to witness that happening and that recursiveness in real time. Okay, let me end from my book with this sense again of accompaniment, and one of the ways that I was able to finish Dreaming in the Fault Zone in writing it in 2023. This had been a long brewing book. I lived with this book, as is not uncommon for writers. I lived with this book for a very, very long time, and it took a lot of different forms, and a lot was, I threw out a lot of writing, and then circumstances and events, in the world often changed, and what I could write, how I could write came in. But I hit an impasse or a block in finishing it early in 2023, and one of the ways I was able to go on and finish it was thinking that this is something I'm writing for others. And, that can sound grandiose, that can sound a little self-inflated, but I really meant that literally. And the project, in fact, had started as curations of many people and for audiences. And so it really began in a dialogic way with events and gatherings and conversations in the Bay Area around healing and art, and also the roles that language and imagery play in medicine and in healing, and just really and letting ourselves be, letting the direction of the curation and of the event series be shaped by who we encountered, with me and my fellow curators. So, for instance, when I met some disability activists, Petra Kuppers, Neil Marcus, Sadie Wilcox, Amber DiPietra. When I met these people, they changed how I thought about healing and how I thought about cure. And so that reshaped the series, and really profoundly changed my life. So a way that I was able to pick up the book again and finish it was to think, there are things I'm writing here that maybe can do for other people what so many writers, associates, books have done for me. The accompaniment that has been with me as I've been writing, and that helps me to go on and to feel like I can explore and I can try things out in writing and in life. So yeah, this sense, and that goes back to where the book begins in the ancient Mediterranean of dreaming for others. The people that were too ill or too weak to make the pilgrimage to the temple, they could send someone in their place. Someone could go in their place, and they could sleep in the abaton, the dormitory. They could sleep for them and dream for them. And there are testimonies in the literature of like a mother going there and dreaming for her daughter and having a dream, a healing dream, where the remedy is enacted in the dream. And then she goes home, and the daughter's had the same dream, and the daughter's now well. So that was fascinating to me, this sense of, empathy as a kind of physical, being there for someone, doing for someone. And along with these thoughts, and as I worked through my blocks and my grief at the pandemic and everything that had transpired, one of the a Greek word that came back to me was the word thumos, Thumos. And I had a little bit of writing, one of the last chapters of the book, a chapter called Winged Tablet. It begins where I go to visit my father's grave and my grandparents' grave in a very run-down, sad, depressing little cemetery in northern New Jersey. And my friend that I mentioned, who travels also in this realm of incubation and impasse and the healing dimensions of language, as I said, Robert Kochik. So Robert accompanied me. He went with me, on the train, crossing the river from New York to New Jersey and walking through the gate of the cemetery. And there I remember that when we used to visit the grave, when I was a child, my grandmother, when we used to visit my grandfather's grave, my grandmother would come and she would bring incense. And that word in Greek is thymiama, and so it has the same root from thumos, or in modern Greek, thymos. And she would burn this frankincense, this incense, in a little, very old shoe polish tin, because my grandfather had had a shoe repair business at one time. And so incense and the act of recalling the past both have their root in Greek from this word thumos or themos. And thumos, ancient thumos, as I write here in my book, were the gods like to strike, a word that meanders in the ancient texts, sometimes meaning vital force or spirit, and sometimes meaning wrath. And thumos is embedded in other words, like the word for desire, in modern Greek. And you'll often find that root in a lot of words in psychology about mood, But thumos came back to me, and I remembered this part that I had written about the visit to the cemetery in March 2020, right as New York was about to go into lockdown. And I looked more deeply into thumos or themos, and I started reading philosophers and philologists' gloss on the word. And it's a very multivalent word. And thumos came to me, and maybe this is a way in which I feel that language can be healing. This word and everything that it implied or suggested actually helped me to finish the book. So this is from the last chapter, which is called World Parados. Thumos is cognate with words in Sanskrit and other languages for burning offerings, for sacrifice and fumigation. It is the breath that re-enters a recovering body, as opposed to that which leaves a dying one. As the meanings of thumos accrue, motivation remains at its core, even as the word becomes subsumed in anger. And so today, the standard meaning of that in modern Greek is anger, and it's the root of the verb to become angry. So thumos is a political emotion. It seethes and boils. You argue with your thumos about which course of action to take. You ride it as far as you can go. In the old language, to remember something is to place it in your heart, to place it in your thumos or as your thumos. Is this the storehouse that episodic and collective memory make of our bodies? Or is it what makes a person a victim? The word in Greek is thema, a victim bled for sacrifice. It can feel like a curse when your body reenacts to have an immune system that remembers too well. But there is memory transmuted into something deeper than reaction, a scab in the lungs that hardens into a seed. There is memory that is not reenaction of the self's wounds, but motivation to go to the other side. I had not imagined that one day there would be a movement of the disbelieved, those who remember in the face of oblivion. And here I'm talking about, which I write on a previous page, about an alliance of people with long COVID and ME, or what's called in the United States chronic fatigue syndrome, and their movement that rose in the last few years. What if we did not invisibilize the ones with post-infectious syndromes and immune disorders and autoimmunity because their memories make us afraid, because they seem like sensitive Roderick Usher from the Poe story, whose heart resounds as soon as it's touched? What if we did not try to confine them as unreliable narrators, as if we, might be undead? Those who remember live in the present. They accept the gift of chronicity, of unmastered forms, constant travel. There is no cure, and this is community. So, in thinking about doing and making work, I wanted to invite you, if you wish, to reflect yourself in this time right now and maybe do a little bit of writing, and then if you're inclined, share it with us. Who or what will you accompany in this time? Whose side will you be? Will you be beside? Who or what will you dream for? I'll repeat those invitations. And then maybe we could take about 5 minutes. Who or what will you accompany in this time? Whose side, or who will you be beside? Who or what will you dream for? Okay. Would someone like to share their writing or some part of their writing? Oh, should we go with the microphone? So. Thank you.
Hold on. Let me see. Can we get this turned on? Is it on? Here's a guy.
Alright, it's a bit flowery, but okay, I'll read it. I wish to be beside my friends as they waver between the crystal surface of circumstance and the oceanic depth of possibility, with a wavering balance between their poles of change and stagnation, the familiar and the spontaneous, and a dream for this balancing to guide my own trajectory toward new techniques which can flow. I dream to be changed by the world of the other, and for the other to be changed by the awkward movement I put onto the scene, such that concern for self and other need not be dichotomized, but rather flow like a subtle dance.
Thank you so much. Oh, great.
Some of the things, like, it doesn't know exactly how they wrote it.
It's okay.
I just, because I wrote faster than I thought, I guess.
Thank you. I love that it's not a dichotomy between self and other. Thank you. Is there somebody else that would like to share their writing? There.
Do I need to turn this on and off, or you are? Great, thank you.
I wrote in the character of a story that I'm writing. So, I will accompany the physical realm of clutter and love, and grief and loss, melancholy, Christ being in health. The tumor of my being reaches forth into the symbolic, making me aware of what I've become. Let us make love under the moonlit sky, crying and shaking for our mothers. I will dream for the brand new leopard skin pillbox hat and the hate by which she drives me to become someone greater than I am, a more complete man.
Thank you. I love that you wrote in your character's voice. That's so great. Thank you. Anyone else?
I wrote, I think I have to be by my own side, selfish in the way that the whole world is mine, if only to care for. Selfish in the way that I want what is best for my intra and intrapersonal ecosystems, because I know they are so equally connected. I will be by the side of my enemy, so as to crumble the walls they have put between us, by the side of myself when I become my own enemy. I will dream for liberation of all, for ourselves, from ourselves. Dream of liberation from anger and fear for myself, so that I may accurately know how its cessation comes about.
Thank you. Oh, I'm going to be carrying that with me, being by the side of my enemy. Thank you.
I will dream for all those closed eyes, all those whose voices come up short or coughed out, ignorant, mimicking, since fear has wrapped itself around their neck like a noose. The smog makes us all stand in lines and swipe cards. We forget our hunger, our damp sheets, and the doors that must be locked before we sleep. We all want the same thing, someone to look in our eyes behind the baseball caps or the whiskers of makeup, for them to see the person, the human, the animal that must be hidden in order to toe the lines.
Thank you. I picked up on mimicry, and it feels like what I was saying earlier about mirroring, this kind of natural reaction, to mirror the oppressor, and how to get out of that stricture of fear, mirroring back, this very restricted range of feeling and response to the world. Thank you. Anyone else?
My dream is for the world to let go of power, to invite the good in humanity. We don't own anything or anyone. It appears that the dream is only a dream until you open your eyes into the reality. Humanity is suffering. We don't learn to appreciate the human experience. We only tend to step into our own grieving for the trauma that will continue till we find the peace we seek, individually and as a collective. I dream for us, for them, for you. My dream is our dream.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned grief. And as I was reading Rafat El-Harir's book, I was thinking, grieving is doing something. Reading. I think Rafat would say that reading is doing something. Recording, remembering. And again, we try things or we do things. We don't know how they might treat or heal or what impact. Actually, I don't even like that word. What effect or efficacy they can have. But the sense of needing, collective spaces of where we can grieve and dream, and because they're not. They can come together, right? They can be entangled. I think some of the places and loci and people and writers I've been holding, there's a lot of grief in, whether it was Brandon Shimoda's event at City Lights, of course, reading Rafat El-Harir's book. It's wonderful for me to hear your writing and your thinking. This will change what I do next, or it will help. It will help to shape it. And poetics for me is, if you've read the beginning of my book, you'll see you know that poetics to me is not just theories of poetry or the art of composition. It's really about the composition of relation. It's how things, people, beings, how things connect and how they can be related. And so in San Francisco now, with some other people, including 2 wonderful medical students that give me hope, we're thinking about, what is Poetics of Healing now? Is there value in thinking about poetics of healing? Right? What is the place of aesthetics, of listening, and of diction and tone, and whether it's in a clinical encounter or the kind of art that we make, if we think that it can have some kind of healing dimension, or that it can help people, or that it can accompany people in some way. And so what you've said today and read, and what you will say, because we should go on to Q&A now, but that is going to help me, and that's going to accompany me as I meet with my collaborators in San Francisco and think about, well, what can we do here now in this moment? How should we be meeting each other and meeting this moment and thinking about Poetics of Healing now? And it's going to be different than when I curated events, in 2010 or 2013. Even as a lot of those conditions and the impasse remains the same. Okay? Thank you so much, everyone, and thank you. Thanks for letting me extemporize, and which is being here and now and feeling, speaking as I'm feeling. So with that, if anyone has any questions, be happy to respond. Thank you, Shaw, for ferrying the microphone around.
All right, it's I don't know. It's kind of a bit hard to truncate into one sentence, but it's also kind of related to some of the little write-up I guess had to do about its relationship to the. You remember earlier near the beginning, maybe I don't know, the first quarter of the lecture, you mentioned this irreducibility of the other to categories. This very much reminds me to the way a philosopher I've read before, Emmanuel Levinas, conceives of otherness, and specifically Levinas sees this in if I don't want to ramble too much, but sees this in relationship to a philosopher, Edmund Husserl's idea that we see the possibilities of the other or whatever, and that's kind of what makes others, people, and not just people but things, intelligible as their possibilities. And that Levinas would say, well, the other is that which is beyond all the possibilities. But I think there's maybe an interesting tension or complication here between there's the way that yes, the other can be that which ruptures possibility, but I think Husserl actually has an interesting point in and it's partly to one essay I'm writing for my project, that part of a relationship to the other, that when we see the other in their actuality, it kind of changes our own possibilities, and vice versa. When we enact in the world, it sort of changes the possibilities of the other in receptivity. So I'm wondering if there's something to be said of this. There's this distance of maybe the problem isn't that understanding, but that understanding is understood sort of this sort of static way, and then rather than this dynamic of the way that our possibilities sort of exchange with each other. I don't know if that really coheres into a question, but I don't know if you see which direction I'm going with it. But do you have any thoughts on what I said? Or
I love what you said, and that you're bringing in Levinas and Husserl, I think you said, and yeah, I mean, the ethics of the other. That's been important to me. One of the reasons also that I write about ethnography and anthropology is because I do believe in, while anthropology has suffered from discourses of exotic others and of allegedly giving voice to others, I do ethnography is a form that's still important to me, and several of the ethnographers I write about are so-called native ethnographers. They're writing their own culture, they're writing their relationship to, and sometimes their quarrel, with their culture. But it's like I say in that chapter, The New Score, and also The Outside Inside about medicine. It matters to know about other ways, and it matters to know about other responses and what other people have come up with, not because we can appropriate them or steal them or just graft them onto our own culture or context, but because they reaffirm that inventiveness and that ingenuity for survival and for thriving. Because there are other ways, it reminds us and it reinvigorates us that there are other ways for us, right? There are other things that we can conceive of, that we can try, that we can invent, that we can, other paths that we can go down. So thank you for reminding us about the other. Yeah.
Okay, so I've been toying with several things throughout the lecture and trying to collect and connect them, but I'm slightly overcaffeinated and certainly emotional, so forgive me if my thoughts are messy and my voice shakes. But yeah, I think something that keeps reoccurring for me is that hope is something that lives in the space between faith and fear. And I have a quote from Larissa Pham that says, "If I'm willing to lose myself in what can be said without words, it must be the voicing of my own feelings I'm frightened of. Or no, it's the asking, and worse yet, the needing. That's what paints me as a discreet and vulnerable subject and opens me to disappointment, and to that which is worse than disappointment, the kind of hurt I can't anticipate." And this is really relevant for me and brings up a lot of points around faith and fear, and really with power, and that there's a lot to be said about the unknown and the fear of the unknown and the faith in what you can't see, and the power that holds over you. And I think a lot about God with these things, which is interesting. As a non-religious person, I didn't think that it would come up so much, but I think about the ways that religious people have such a faith in the unknown and also a fear of the unknown, and people displaying their devoutness to God. You know, I hear like God-fearing Christian, and I think that it's interesting how that ties in. And I think, speaking in terms of opacity, which you mentioned, God and religion is really a way to be accepted as your whole complex and opaque self, and really just like God holds space for your complexity. And I think there's also power in that, and I don't know, I think in contrast to opacity, I think of transparency and how it's so vulnerable to be transparent and honest and really open up, like show your soft belly to somebody. But there's also vulnerability in being an opaque and complex self and having somebody accept you for that wholly. And I think that's something that most would desire, and that religion gives to people. And really what instills the need for faith, and in turn hope, because no matter how much faith you have in something, you still need to hope for it. And there would be no faith without question and doubt. It's impossible to have faith in something that can't be doubted. And just the vulnerability and visibility, and I said them all out of order, but I think that I'm really interested in your thoughts on faith as in the context of hope, and how fear comes in there.
Thank you for all of that. I'm really glad to hear your thinking and where you're going, and in response to my talk. Faith is not something I think a lot about, quite honestly. I do think a lot about doubt and skepticism. It's interesting what you said, that there is no faith without doubt. I really like what you said something like God holds all the complexity of who you are, or you were kind of aligning God with opacity, is what I think I picked up, which is very interesting to me. I like that God. That God I like. I mean, the God that's wielded, the kind of God that's wielded as a tool of fear. When I speak about fundamentalism or a fundamentalist society or fundamentalist vengeance, I'm not speaking about, let's say, Christian fundamentalists or I'm not necessarily speaking about religious fundamentalists, although I'm not speaking about them. I'm speaking about an attitude and a kind of mentality that's entrenched in America, in a way of reading. There was a great book by, the author escapes me right now, but it's called The Literal Word. And, this idea of, I remember George W. Bush's press secretary scolded, I think this is in my book at some point, like he scolded his press secretary scolded the press corps, the White House press corps, saying the president doesn't speak in metaphors, like, what? Everybody speaks in metaphor. You can't think. You can't think without metaphor, right? It's just, George Lakoff, that, will tell you about that. But this idea that, we're about straight talk and not all of that woke stuff. And so, yeah, a faith that is not fundamentalist and that comes out of an embrace or an openness to the unknown and to doubt and to different ways and unknown ways. That is interesting to me. Somewhere else in the book I say that, I'm an atheist. I don't have a faith, not a religious faith. And I don't have a whole lot of faith, other kinds of faith either, to be honest. But I say that I'm an atheist, but I have an enthusiasm for religious icons and writing about spirituality, religion, and hagiographies. And part of that is my upbringing. It's cultural. It's where I come out of. So that at least for me, that itself, that kind of not being a person of faith and being an atheist, and yet being drawn to what some people would call spiritual modes, the spiritual dimensions, writing about both ancient religion and ways that through art and aesthetics we can find, I'll just say it, perhaps something like communion. I think that people could pick that up. I don't fully understand all of that, just as, I would never say I don't fully understand everything I've written, because I can't, because every reader is going to remake what I've written, and like you have, draw it into what matters to you. So, thank you. Yeah. Anyone else? I love coming to Evergreen because everyone is so smart and has such great comments and questions, and it's such a pleasure to be here.
I had a question. Yeah. It struck me earlier when you were talking about opacity and early on in the lecture, and you mentioned this quote that talked about this clarity in opacity. And my question is, in sort of like, because when you talk about this opacity, this dark, you're sort of displacing the sort of transparency of cybernetic capital. But when we talk about this clarity in opacity, do you ever worry about the possibility of inscribing a new order into that very opacity and sort of casting sort of light upon the dark? And, because I mean, at least a worry of mine is that healing still has this idea of health associated with it, which if we're producing health, like the production of health is very tied up in biopolitics, and yeah.
Thank you. That's great comments, great questions. Yeah, that opacity has its own clarity. I drew from Glissant, Edouard Glissant. It's been useful to me and helpful and sustaining in several ways, but one of the ways in which, in a time where identity can be also something that's wielded, like dividing people up into identities, right, and othering them, whether you're going to incarcerate them, deport them, tell them that they don't exist, right? We see that kind of resurgent now. So opacity in that sense has been important to me. But, you're absolutely right. Anything that is heterodox, antinomian, oppositional, right? Anything can be recuperated and can become institutional itself. And institutions are great. Academia is great, right, at taking the heterodox and absorbing it, right, and kind of defanging it and taking its power away. As for health, yeah, I mean, health, I don't see health as something that's produced, but rather as something that exists. And this is picking up on a couple of medical humanities scholars, critical medical humanities scholars in the UK. But health is something that exists in relation, between beings, between bodies, not something that a body is or is not. And one of the reasons that I was drawn to traditional Chinese medicine that I write about in the book is that it wasn't absolute. It wasn't like you were healthy or you were sick. As Western medicine or allopathic medicine insists. That there's a spectrum and that things can be out of balance. And even if things are out of balance, you're not sick in the sense that carries a kind of stigma or perhaps failing with it. So, the title of my book, The Fault Zone, has different meanings, or people can find different meanings in it. In part, the fault zone refers to literal landscapes that have been therapeutic landscapes, and that have, that are volatile, seismically volatile landscapes. But there's also a very simple pun in there that people are blamed for illness, blamed for disability, and there's a kind of identity that happens with identification, with accusation, with finger pointing. You go to the doctor and they say, well, you have cancer because you smoked. You got a heart attack because you didn't manage your stress. And so the individual, right, or the alleged individual becomes, the agent of their misfortune and of their suffering. So I'm not sure. If you want to reiterate any part of that, please do. But I certainly agree about the dangers of a focus on health, not to re-stigmatize the ill and not to coerce some kind of, mandatory health. I mean, wellness culture can be very problematic for that, and that's of course tied to a long tradition in America, in the United States, of self-improvement and self-reliance, and always trying to improve yourself. And that's something that's very much on my mind as I was writing this as well. Yeah. Is that it? Okay. But if you want to talk about anything, please come up and meet me. Okay. Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you.